All right. I'm on. You on?
Am I on?
You're on.
I'm on. Okay. Well, folks, here we are. We always glad to see you. It's a very beautiful day outside. We were supposed to have rain today, but maybe the rain has already gone through. We've had 3 or 4 days of rain, but we are going to continue our study of David, and John Micah covered very thoroughly Psalm 51 this morning. So we're going to talk about some of the circumstances around it that a few of them that he did not mention, because there's just more things you could actually mention.
And we're excited that you keep using the word we, that you're back.
Well,
So it is us or we this morning, so that's good.
well, glad to be back.
Glad you're back. So 2 Samuel chapter 11 through 12. And when you put this in, I did not even realize so that's real. They made a movie, or I have not seen that. I didn't know that was there.
Probably the best movie made. You know, of course, they always have a lot of mistakes in the movies and do a lot of filling in that's not there. I mean, they've got so much information they don't have to do that, but they do. But Gregory Peck is one of my favorite actors, and he did a splendid job playing David in this. So when you go to the internet and look, if you hit movie, there actually were more than one movie, but this is the one that always pops up.
Well, I figured when I saw it that it was real. You wouldn't put a real person like Gregory Peck on there if it wasn't. But I just didn't know that it was out there, so that's interesting. And then an interesting connection to some of the other conversations we've had, just the way this chapter starts in 2 Samuel. It gives you a bunch of information about the time of year that it is. And this is a calendar from Gezer, which the archaeology department at Lanier has been digging at Gezer for 10 years. And they just keep finding things. But this is interesting that this tablet of the calendar matches what the biblical text is telling us is going on at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 11.
Right. This text was discovered several years ago. I've only been to Gezer one time in my trips to Israel. It was off limits, and in fact, I think the time we asked Ami to take us, he wasn't supposed to. We went through some farm territory, and they didn't have it set up or not, but we got to see it. But in the early excavations of this place, they found this calendar. And of course, we always use this in the book of Joshua, because in the book of Joshua, people ask the question, well, how do we know what time of year it was? Well, this calendar tells us. The spies were hiding upstairs at Rahab's house in the season when flax were cut. And that's what this calendar tells us, you see.
March.
So we're able to pin it down. And that's the same time that the Jordan floods, usually when it floods. So the point Stan's making is the Bible sometimes uses things like this to pinpoint when things happen.
Exactly. And so that first verse there of 11 says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to war, which, that's not listed over there as the things to do. But that's what the author of Samuel tells us.
Yeah, this dealt with the crops and harvesting. Okay.
And David sent Joab, as John Micah mentioned. But here, David's sending Joab and all of his men up to all of his men and all Israel, which I know you love that. All Israel. Is it absolutely everybody, or is it not everybody? But it says that. That's the translation. It's all.
It's just the word "all" is a very flexible word in Hebrew, and this is a battle scene from several years later, about maybe 300 years later, when Ashurbanipal, I think it's Ashurbanipal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ashurbanipal went to war, and his artists, after he got back, they drew this and showed you just how vicious war was.
Yeah, and that's what the text is in our minds, trying to get us acclimated to what's going on. David and his men are in the throes of a battle like this, when all this action in chapters 11 and 12 are taking place. So David sent Joab and all of his men, and they destroyed the Ammonites, and they besieged Rabbah, as John mentioned in his sermon. And just look at that traveling distance. They had to go all the way across from Jerusalem, the city of David, which we looked at last week, over to Ammon, where they were actually fighting.
Which is Amman, Jordan today. And some of you we've had about 6 extensions to Jordan. I know that the Shannons went to Jordan, right, Bill? And they loved Jordan. I remember that very much. We stayed at a beautiful hotel there. But Amman, Jordan today is ancient Rabbath Ammon of the Bible. This is where they were fighting. And believe it or not, it's only 45 miles or so from Jerusalem as the crow flies to Amman. It's just not that far.
But some rough terrain to get there.
Yeah, the sub-F they go through, but you go through Jericho. Always we cross at the Allenby Bridge there near Jericho. And anyway, gives you an idea.
And then this was an interesting shot. This is what it looks like today. And when we talk about the city of David is this old Jerusalem down here in the dashed dotted lines. It's to the south of the Temple Mount. And so that is Jerusalem, but the city of David, or Old Jerusalem, is down below what's actually up at the higher elevation. And so you might be thinking, what we wanted to do is we wanted to tell things from different perspectives. Not picking on John, but even this morning, you might have noticed in the sermon, something goes by pretty quickly when you look at this story with David and Bathsheba, and that is that David got up from his nap or whatever he was doing. He was walking around in his palace, and he looked down, and you read all of that, and you think, okay, he's in an elevated position because he's the king, both physically and also powerfully in society. But we want to look at the physical part. This picture is actually showing you that the level of David's palace is there at the top where that awning is, where they're doing some excavation. And then this stepped stone structure is how high he's up above the people of kind of I guess in a way I can say commoners of the town, right? And their residences are down here, like this house of a hill here. And that gives you a little bit of perspective of why he would be able to get up and walk around at night and actually see other people. I think one of the things you mentioned about the movie, and movies always get things wrong. Well, we get things wrong too. We think that David is walking around with binoculars looking in people's windows trying to see who's taking a bath, and that's not how it was at all. It was just the way the geographic area was laid out and where his residence was compared to the others.
Right. Yeah, and we have the Palace of David. We know where that is now. We have a lady archaeologist who unfortunately recently died, but she believes she has found the Palace of David up there. And so that's one of the new archaeological things.
Because one of the things she found, I'm glad you brought that up, one of the things she found were the capitals at the top of these columns right here. And they found, what, three of them, I think?
I've forgotten how many, but
yeah.
They're the ones that had the red on them there.
Yeah, buried in the ground that would show that this structure did exist and that they're completely preserved where they found them. So David arose from his bed and walked around the roof of the king's house, and this might be what it would look like in olden days, like not what we just looked at for the archaeological restoration part that's going on now. Another rendition, Tissot has so many paintings of all the stories that we keep talking about. Here's his version, where you can see that David is apparently groggy there, waking up from whatever he's doing. It's not nighttime, it's dusk, it looks like. And then you put this one in, which is a little bit more helpful as far as the idea of maybe the proximity. And I liked what John said in the sermon. The previous picture shows a woman washing Bathsheba's feet over there to the right. This one shows someone standing there with a towel waiting for her to dry off. But like John said, we don't really know what part or how many parts of her she was actually washing. We just know that David was attracted to what he saw and his perspective of how he was able to see it. And then just the fact that she's very attractive would not necessarily mean she had to be completely disrobed for her beauty to be recognized, right? Could just be him seeing her. Now, what's fascinating to me, though, when I think about this, I don't know if you've ever considered this, is that he finds out what we're getting ready to go back through, that this is Uriah's wife. Uriah is one of his mighty men who he knows very well. Seems kind of odd that Uriah and Bathsheba have never come over for dinner, and he's never been introduced to Bathsheba before. So that's interesting. Maybe Uriah knew, don't let him see her because she's too attractive. I don't know.
Yeah, in the list of heroes of David and mighty men of David, in 2 Samuel 23, Uriah the Hittite is listed as one of the 37 top soldiers. Think about that. He made the Hall of Fame. This wasn't just some minor soldier David wiped out. It was a general or a commander.
Exactly. So here's an interesting sign. Again, looking at all these evidences, and some of you that are in the room and online have been over there, but here is Bathsheba's sign, Bathsheba Street, which is interesting. Just again, all these, if these were not real people, there would not be all these connections to them over there. And then this one I thought was interesting that you put in the true story of Bathsheba, victim or villain. Well, I think this morning we pretty much covered that, victim.
Yeah, it's my belief she was a victim. A lot of people want to put some blame on her, but Scripture clearly puts the blame on David. He was in charge. He called the shots, and so they like to make a big deal about that. And some of the shots what we did, we gave you the decent shots. Some of you gave you some pretty sexy shots of Bathsheba that he saw, and so we avoided those shots.
Yeah, and I would just say John did this in functionality this morning without actually stopping and saying the sentence. But we would, in a deep study that you can do too, it doesn't matter if you do it in Hebrew or English, follow the verbs. Everything that David verbally does through the sentence structure is his action of seeing, requesting, taking, bringing, sleeping with, returning, sending the message for Uriah. Everything that's being done that's an action is from David.
Right.
Bathsheba is not saying, he doesn't say, well, we shouldn't do this, and then she says, oh, come on, or anything like that. That's a fabricated story. So her verbs are just because she is under the rule of the king and has no way to say no, and so she reports there, just like Uriah reports for his duty instructions that he's going to get because the king gave them to him.
Right. So David coveted, committed adultery, murdered. 3 of the 10 commandments right there in this situation.
And I would also think lied too. Lied as well, because when the troops, we're going to look at it here in a minute, but when the Joab knows what was really written in the letter and what really happened.
Right.
But David says, well, when they ask, why this went this way, well, just tell them that it went this way because of these things. Not because I wrote a letter and told it to go that way so that Uriah would die.
Right.
So that would be a fabrication of.
Yeah, and as John Micah hit on today, Uriah was a person of integrity because he said, should I go to my wife's house with my soldiers in the field? Remember, he's the commander. My soldiers are in the field. They can't see their wives. And so he said, it'd be a terrible thing. So David gets him drunk. I don't know what that falls under, but it was same category, I guess. And yet he still, though he was drunk, he still didn't go down there. And then to show his integrity, David trusted him enough to send the message to Joab by the hand of Uriah. So he's carrying his own death sentence with him. David knowing he won't break that seal and look at it because he's a person of integrity.
Yeah.
And another thing you will find out, maybe we'll touch on today, later in 2 Samuel, when the revolt takes place and Absalom breaks with David, Ahithophel, one of his top, if not the top counselor at the palace, sides with Absalom. And you wonder, why in the world, after all those years with David, he would side with this rebellious son when he drives David to Jerusalem? Well, when you look in that list of heroes in 2 Samuel 23, Ahithophel is the father of Eliab, who is another Roman, another commander, and Eliab is the father of Bathsheba. Oh, so I think that Ahithophel was furious at David. He may have been very fond of his granddaughter's husband, and so anyway, just an extra little point because people wonder why in the world would Ahithophel rebel with David that late in life, and I think that's the reason.
Excellent point. So here is this not Bathsheba? He says. David, wants to identify who it is, and here's a seal that says Uriah, son of Neriah, which is also interesting. Found from the Second Iron Period, 10th to 7th centuries BC. So we keep finding things that just keep corroborating all of these different facts.
Yeah, Uriah is actually a Hebrew name, so he was a Hittite soldier, so it kind of implies that he was a convert, because his name, he took a name, Uriah, that means Yahweh is light. So,
which is interesting. That might be why you state his name and then parenthetically say the Hittite,
right,
because you would need that explanation. You wouldn't get it from the name.
right.
And so, as we've mentioned, he's a faithful warrior, and we're talking about the David's mighty men, the 37, and then the 3 from the 37 that are even at the top of all of them, and he's one of those. And so he is somebody that David trusts, knows very well, protects David's life, and as John rightfully pointed out, he sold out for the king and the king's protection and the king's mission, more so even than his own household and his wife in this case. And so this is just another, down there at the bottom, I just put in that the terrace slopes that we looked at are how David would have seen Bathsheba. And then maybe, this is just a possibility, I say here, that the palace proximity to Uriah's house might have been because Uriah was one of the mighty men, one of the top 37, who served as David's personal bodyguards, which, as you've referenced, you can see in 2 Samuel 23:39. Doesn't mean it has to be that way, but that would make a lot of sense. If they're protecting the king, they would live closer to him than others. And then this is Joab, or Yoav Street for Joab. So, just another character we're looking at here, another street named after them. This is an interesting text from verses 20 through 24. If the king becomes angry and asks you, why did you go so close to the city to fight? Didn't you realize that they would shoot from the wall who struck down Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone down on him from the wall so that he died in Thebes? Why then did you go so close to the wall? So in other words, they're going to critique this instruction that David has sent with Uriah, which says, go up, then pull back, leave him there, and then he'll be killed. But he needs to be in some sort of dangerous, risky place for that to actually happen. So they go too close to the wall from what usually archers would normally do. They would stay further back. And he's saying, if you get asked about this, this is what you say. Your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. So the messenger departed. So he sends that to go back to David, saying that if you get asked about that, just make the statement that he's dead, which I interpret as that's Joab letting David know that Joab knows what David had said to do. And this guy who's the messenger does not know any of that. Right. And by saying that sentence, he goes, oh, okay, so that's why you went so close to the wall, is because of the order I gave you.
Right. See, usually our president knows nothing about war. We've had Eisenhower, who knew a lot about war. We had General Grant, who knew a lot about war. But generally speaking, the president knows nothing about war. But when you have a president and a king who is a warrior and knows all about war, they got a lot of questions when things did not go well. Well, why did we get clobbered by the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Philistines? Well, because they had to make excuses. And a lot of times top soldiers got removed or executed just because they made a wrong decision, cost a lot of men's lives. So this man is going back to report, and he's giving a normal report. A normal report was, well, this happened, and he said, if David gets upset, just say, oh, by the way, Uriah's been killed too. And then David, of course, comes and says, well, it happens in war. He gave David a easy thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. That's what the next screen is going to say is the messenger says these things to David. The men overpowered us and attacked us in the field, but we forced them to retreat all the way to the door of the city gate. And then the archers shot at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's soldiers died. Your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. And there's the picture of him, unfortunately, receiving the arrows. And so David explains to the messenger from General Joab that the fact that Uriah was killed happens all the time to brave warriors. Like, be of good cheer. This is why these men risk their lives for this, and bad stuff sometimes happens. It's basically what he's trying to cover it up with. And then this was to your point. Why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, I forgot that this was in there. Yeah, so anyway, we know Bathsheba has to be. Some people have said, well, look at these 4 women in Jesus' genealogy. There are a couple of her Canaanites. You got a Moabite, and then Bathsheba's married to a Hittite. But Bathsheba clearly had to be a Hebrew because her father, again, was one of those soldiers. Her grandfather was a Hithoel, and so anyway, this is what I was trying to explain a while ago.
Yeah.
And I think this is the reason that Hithoel turns against David. It was really a big risk on his part, and he ends up hanging himself over it.
And I think because you have all that up there, you read it as Uriah parenthetically stated the Hittite, and I read Bathsheba with no parenthetical statement of the Hebrew and not the Hittite. So therefore, there's nothing in parenthesis. She must be a Hebrew.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? No label means you're an Israelite.
Yeah, all the evidence points to her being an Israelite.
Yeah. So for David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything, the Lord commanded all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite.
Ooh.
Which is a strong statement.
Ooh. Except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite.
And so, as was mentioned in the sermon, Bathsheba is informed that Uriah has died, and she goes into this mourning period. And this is another Tissot painting, but this is what we also looked at in our lesson with Ruth, right? When Ruth's husband died and her headed to the threshing floor, we said her mourning period was over, and she was making that statement by dressing and putting on makeup and putting on nice clothes and saying, I'm done with the sackcloth and the mourning. And so apparently Bathsheba does the same thing, or at least David says she's done, because then he calls her to the palace, and then they end up getting married. And so he becomes her husband, and she becomes his wife. And then it says very quickly in the text, they immediately go back to their activities and are pregnant with the first son that then God says through Nathan here in a minute is going to be a problem. And here's Nathan's name. Then Yahweh sent Nathan to David. So don't you know that was interesting? We don't really know what Nathan was doing, where he was. We just know that he gets the call, you're needed now at the palace to go send David a message directly from God.
One thing about David that you can tell he was not bitter at Nathan, because now Bathsheba is going to have 4 sons that are named for us, and one of them is named Nathan. They named one of the children Nathan. Never would have named a child Nathan if they had been bitter at the prophet Nathan. So David doesn't show any animosity there. Named a child Nathan. I probably would have never named a child Nathan, even though Nathan was right and he chewed me out.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting irony. So the inscription here on this seal is Nathan belonging to the son of Ahimelech. So interesting how that was found. And then here's Nathan the prophet street. So we just keep, almost every single person in this entire story has a street named after them in Israel.
You keep noticing the T's or THs, like Bathsheba is Bathsheba in English because in Old Hebrew, they used to, the T was pronounced, when you put a dot in it, it was pronounced a T. When you didn't have the dot, it was pronounced a TH. But in modern Hebrew, both of them are pronounced as a T. That's why that's different. And B's are pronounced V. Sometimes in Hebrew, B like Abraham is sometimes pronounced like they pronounce it Avraham. But sometimes it's a B. So that's why you see these names, and they didn't have an I or J, so that's why the Y is in there a lot. So it's really hard to go from Hebrew to an Indo-European language like Greek. Once it gets in Greek, we pretty well stayed with the name.
Mm-hmm. Good point. And you do know when it's a B and when it's a V, but there's a lot to keep up with when you're reading it. So then Yahweh sent Nathan to David. Here's another painting of what this might have looked like. I always find these interesting. I don't know, just in my head, that I would go with David being clustered away, almost as if he's sick. I mean, I don't. At this point, he's not aware. To him, he's not really realizing what he's done. So some of the paintings are more in line of ignorance, I think, I guess what I'm saying, or oblivion to what is getting ready to be said.
Yeah, I think just David and Nathan were there.
Yeah.
Just those two people were there.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody else was present when Nathan let him have it.
Yeah. And so he comes and he tells this little parable, really. It's the first parable. When we did parables in here, 2 years ago, we looked at there are parables in the Old Testament as well, and here's one of them. Here's a little story that's not true, that's not real, but is applicable to David about this man. There were two men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor, and they both had flocks, but one guy had a flock of one, and one guy had a flock of a whole bunch. And so the wealthy man could have had any lamb that he wanted from all the ones he had, right? But the man who had one, it was a pet. And this is interesting. You could say, well, here we go. The guy's up there that loves animals and has all these pets. And so, of course, the little lamb is a pet for this guy. But this is actually corroborated on the next screen. There's actually a relief on a sarcophagus of a man with a sheep. And look, the sheep's in his house like dogs are, and he's petting on his feet, and it's under the table there. So some people didn't treat their one little animal for food. Some of them treated them as a pet, and that's part of the parable, right?
Yeah, a lot of people have made pets, I think, out of lambs. But anyway, I know we did this a couple of years ago, but I'll just mention it again. There's one VeggieTale that has a parable in it. It's King George and the Rubber Ducky. And it's about David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. But they've got how do you present a story like this to children, little children? How do you do that? So it becomes King George and the rubber. He's got this obsession about rubber ducks. And so all of that's kind of silly, but when the prophet comes in, or the wise man comes in, that's Nathan. He's not called Nathan, just a wise man. But he does a flannel board presentation that is fantastic. He shows you, and you got the rich man and all the flocks. You got the poor man, and then the rich man, suddenly a crown jumps on his head. And so, he's talking about King George or King David there. But one of the funniest things that happened is they couldn't have Uriah get killed. So the wise man says to the king, well, you can't send, the people before that, well, you can't send the guy who was playing Uriah into battle. Now, their battles in VeggieTales, if you remember, they threw pies at each other. They creamed each other. And so he says, you can't send him into battle. He'll be creamed. And so, anyway, they have to take away the adultery and the murder and all of that. But the flannel board was really quite good. The parable's quite good.
I think on your 90th birthday and May 26th, we need to watch VeggieTales, The King and the Rubber Ducky together. You would be hilarious to watch that. So Nathan says to David, you are the man. You are the one who has taken this. Because the rest of the parable goes on that, the man who loves that little lamb like his pet, that the man who had the whole herd takes that one and kills it, skins it, cleans it, and then serves him. And he says that guy should be. It's an abomination what that guy did. He should be put. He should be. I don't know. Does he say he should be put to death? He says he should be prosecuted for it for sure. And then Nathan says, "Well, you are that guy. You're the one who did this."
Yeah, again, showing David's sensitivity to God's laws when it applied to other people. Pushing your own problems aside, not putting them in the same category. And yet here he had these horrible sins. I mean, just really horrible sins. And he's upset with a man who's done this with sheep. Of course, it's just a made-up story, but I call it the parabolic mirror that he holds. You hold a mirror in front of somebody and says, "That's you. You're the one." And so that's what Nathan did to him. He held up a mirror, and David suddenly realized, "You are that guy in the mirror."
And that's a great way. I think that's a great image to illustrate a sentence that I always think of, which is the person who is unaware of their unawareness is the person at the most disadvantage. So when Nathan comes into this conversation, David is completely unaware of the things that are so obvious to everybody else.
Right.
David can't see them until, like you say, a mirror is held up, and then all of a sudden he sees them.
Right.
And so that's an interesting
And then
visual.
King George in that parable, when the crown popped on his head, suddenly King George knew he was the guilty guy.
Yeah. So some different images of what it might have looked like. Finally the punchline there from Nathan and David realizing what it is. Some where he's crying, some where he's not crying, some where he looks like he's surprised, others where he's not. But then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord God of Israel has said. I chose you to be king over Israel and rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and put your master's wives into your arms." And he goes on to say, "I would have given you more if you just asked for it." And David said to Nathan, "I've sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord has also put away your sin." So his sin, God's not going to hold this against David, but there's consequences for what David did. So just because the sin is washed away doesn't mean that the actions, because obviously Uriah's dead, and he's not going to be resurrected and sent back. So you're living with the consequences of the decisions you made, but God's not going to hold them against you.
Yeah, you're forgiven, but this will affect the rest of your life.
Exactly. And then it goes on to say, this one we didn't cover in the sermon. It goes on to say that I will give your wives to your companions, and he will lie with them in broad daylight. So basically, all those blessings that God has given to David that came from others are now going to be taken from David and given to others. And we see the text in the story that plays out as well. God says, "You did this thing secretly, but I'll do this thing in broad daylight before all of Israel." So they'll know that it's Yahweh who is taking this away from David.
Yeah, when David flees from Absalom, he leaves 10 concubines at the house, at the palace, to keep it while he's gone. And Ahithophel says, well, the thing to do is to put a tent on top of the house and palace and have sex, let people know you're having sex with his concubines, which means there is no going back. Once you took a member of the harem, then you had gone too far.
And Nathan said to David, "Yahweh has taken away your sin. You shall not die," which is reassuring. But then he says that statement that the sword, before that, "However, the child that is born to you surely will die." And so that's the child that Bathsheba has sent word that she's pregnant. Right. And they know that they are going to have that child, and God says that child will not survive. And then, so after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, and he became ill. And that's when the fervent praying over that child starts happening, where David wants him to be saved, and God doesn't relent. And then he passes away, and then we get that psalm where he gets up and he shaves and bathes and goes and worships, because what the Lord gives and what the Lord takes away is the Lord's decision, not his.
Yeah, this was, I believe, for the child's sake. The child would have grown up in a situation with all those things around him, all that stigma and dirty talk and all that, God just took him on to heaven with him.
Well, that's a nice image to consider. Yeah, David pleads before God for the boy. He fasted. He went into his house and spent the night lying in sackcloth on the ground. The child still dies. So David got up from the ground and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes. And then they quickly conceive again. And this child that comes along as the second child of theirs is, of course, King Solomon. And here's his sign for his street in Israel. And so, right up, we got a few extra minutes. I didn't realize we were going to get finished that fast. But Solomon is, let me back up before I say that. So one of the things that got said today, which is true, is that the people wanted a king. They pled to God to have a human king. God said it's not a good idea. Saul was the first king. David's the second king. Solomon's the third. The king, though, that was the king of Israel originally is Yahweh. And so by choosing a human king, they're saying they don't want God to be their king. They want someone of their own to be their king. But a human king is a sinful, broken person. So, of course, it's not going to go as well as if you left God as your king. And I think that's what we're seeing. What I thought we had in there, that as I went by and realized it's not, is that statement about the sword will never leave your house. You said a while ago that these consequences will follow David for the rest of his life. It's not even just his life. It's the life of his children as well. And there's turmoil in the house.
Right, yeah. God was the king, and they wanted a human king. And God said, well, we'll give you a leader, but he doesn't need to be like the kings of other nations. And that's one of the things that God kept saying and warning them about. And they ended up having kings of other nations. And as you remember, only a few southern kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah, are praised. And the north had no good kings. That is, no good kings at all. One started out good, Jehu, but ended up bad. So he said, no, you don't need to have a king like the Moabites and the Ammonites. You need to have a king who is a godly person and who puts me first as the real king of Israel.
Exactly. And so that's really what we were trying to convey here on this slide as we think about the week ahead, is we are free to make whatever choices we desire because we're free will beings. God's given us that ability. But we are not free from the consequences of our choices, and this story shows that, because David wasn't either. The fact that the sin's not held against him is graciousness from Yahweh and the forgiveness of what he did. But the consequences stay with him. And so that next sentence there, or that next paragraph, we must be careful and always prayerfully discern our next step. One bad decision can have a lifetime of consequences, which is what we see with David. And then unfortunately, really on into Solomon, because Solomon does not do, he's not a man after God's own heart. He does have a whole bunch of wives and concubines, and then allows their gods to be brought in, and then builds temples to their gods as well. And there go more consequences through his life too. So that leads us to this week's prayer. God, we know you love us unconditionally. We also know you give us free will so that we may love you in return. Love would not be love if there were no choice. Thank you for loving us and continuing to love us even as we suffer the consequences of some tough love lessons. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. That clock says that we're done.
Toda Rabbah. Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah. And have a blessed day and enjoy the weather. And may your team win, or if they don't, may your life continue on, as John said this morning.
So much.